So let me just very quickly introduce myself. I am actually Okaka Opio-Dokotum, Associate Professor of Literature and Film at Lera University in Northern Uganda. I am also the Deputy Vice Chancellor in charge of Academic Affairs and Research at my university, and a founding member, proud founding member of ICRRA, the ICRRA network. Before I introduce Professor Alexandra Xanthaki, I want to say something brief about ICRRA. ICRRA is a network that brings together global research and insight on the theory and practice of cultural relations. And when we talk about cultural relations, we are really talking about ways of working internationally in the areas of language, arts, education, heritage, and civil society to build trust and understanding, to promote collaboration, and to enhance and sustain dialogue between people and cultures. So with this conference, what are we aiming at? We're aiming to put our network's knowledge about cultural relations into dialogue with experts on multilateralism and sustainable development. We're doing this in the context of the UN Agenda of 2030 and UN Summit of the Future's call for more effective multilateralism. And we are hoping that our talks and discussions over the course of the conference will help us to better understand how cultural relations can support multilateral and regional organizations to deliver sustainable development. We are glad to have you all on board this morning, and we are hoping that you will be fully engaged in the discussions. Please do post your questions, comments, and reflections in the Q&A box, and we'll go along. We'll aim to cover as many of these the questions that you post as possible. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this morning. Okay. So I have a tough assignment to introduce a very, very eminent speaker this morning. Alexandra Xanthaki is Professor of Law and Director of Research at the Brunel Law School in London, where she earlier served as Deputy Head of Brunel Law School. She teaches human rights and is a leading expert on indigenous rights in international law. She has received the Star Award for her teaching and student support. She's also a member of the Human Rights Faculty of the Center for Continuing Education at the University of Oxford and has been an external examiner in several law departments. Alexandra Xanthaki was appointed UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights in October 2021. Her many publications on cultural rights vary from cultural rights on minorities and indigenous peoples to cultural diversity, cultural heritage, balancing cultural rights with other rights and interests, and multicultural aspects of international human rights law, as well as reparative pedagogy with regards to refugees and migrants. She has over 50 publications to her name. Her outstanding monograph, Indigenous Rights and United Nations Standards, Self-Determination, Culture and Land, is considered a reference source on this topic. In 2011, Alexandra was on the rights of the indigenous peoples, and most recently in July 2023, he published Development and Cultural Rights, the International Governance, a report of the Special Rapporteur in the field of culture, which was transmitted by the UN Secretary General at the 78th session of the United Nations under item 73B. Alexandra Xanthaki's work has been cited repeatedly in United Nations documents. She has given keynote speeches around the world on too many topics to enumerate in this introduction. Our opening keynote speaker is a prolific author, an eloquent speaker, a passionate advocate of cultural rights, and more especially indigenous cultural rights. She believes that cultural justice and fairness is not possible without decolonizing cultural space. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Professor Alexandra Xanthaki. Professor, you can take it away.
Thank you very much. And oh my God, what a wonderful introduction. I want to record it and listen to it when I get up, and I have so many meetings and I'm late in every single one of them. Thank you very much. It is a real pleasure to be here today, and it is an honor to address you all within the remits of this conference. So today I want to talk about development, sustainable development, and cultural rights, and how zoom in the international organizations and explain to you why I have decided to dedicate 2 whole reports before the United Nations General Assembly on this issue. And Chair, am I right to think that I have 45 minutes to explain this to you, or do I have less so that we can have a question and answer session?
All right, thank you so much for helping me out, because I forgot actually to take members through the, I'll just pause you a little bit. So from 10:05 to 10:50 is supposed to be your keynote, that is 45 minutes. And then from 10:50 to 10:55, we have, I'll just do some little wrap up of your presentation. And then after that, from 10:56 to 12:28, we have open discussion.
Thank you.
To 11:28. I'm mixing it with my time. I'm 2 hours ahead. And then, of course, then at 11:28, we are done, and we're getting ready to move to the next session. So you have 45 minutes. I'm very sorry about that. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. So for some time now, in the last few years, sustainable development has become a buzzword in the corridors of the United Nations. There is a lot of talk about sustainable development. The Secretary General has issued a report. The High Commissioner on Human Rights has issued a report, and various other special rapporteurs have discussed other aspects of sustainable development. So I thought that it would be wonderful to read all these documents and understand how the United Nations so far promotes cultural development, so the cultural dimension of sustainable development. Unfortunately, this has not been the case. Cultural rights continue to be the Cinderella of human rights. When we talk about economic, social, and cultural rights and how important they are and how they should take their place next to civil and political rights. When we talk about the indivisibility of human rights and how important this indivisibility is, especially when it comes to development, sustainable development, cultural rights have been absent from all these discussions. The cultural rights framework has been non-existent. It is very interesting that also in the Sustainable Development Goals, culture is not, and the promotion and development of culture is not one of the goals. Not even that, but I think that although we, in international instruments and in Common Article 1 of both covenants, the one on civil and political rights and the one on economic, social, and cultural rights, specify, discuss explicitly cultural development. The cultural dimension of sustainable development has not been taken up by the United Nations community, and even more so by the international community. I think that partly this is because, as I said, cultural rights are the Cinderella of human rights. When we talk about socioeconomic and cultural rights, we really mean social and economic rights. If you actually go to the to textbooks that talk about on economic, social, and cultural rights, it's only very recently that maybe you will see 10 pages on cultural rights. That's really, so this is one of the reasons I think, this omission is glaring at the moment. But another reason why sustainable development does not focus on cultural rights is, I believe, a misunderstanding or a part understanding of what we mean by cultural rights. So for a long time, cultural rights were focused on cultural heritage, but especially cultural heritage and also maybe artistic freedom. Now we know that when we talk about cultural rights, we talk about ways of life. So we talk about, it's a much broader concept. We talk about philosophies of the people, the priorities of the people, the values that they have, the way they see their vision, the way, the vision they have for themselves and their communities. So if we agree that this is what culture is, and UNESCO has agreed, and the United Nations and my mandate puts that forward repeatedly, and the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights has agreed that indeed culture means a way of life. So if this is what culture means, how can sustainable development exist without cultural rights and without a cultural dimension? How can we achieve equality between the sexes if the customs and the values and the practices of the different communities are not reevaluated and revisited in order to value women as much as men? How can we have economic development if the people in the states where this economic development is proclaimed do not agree with the priorities that this economic development has, or do not agree with the principles, their whole values, their whole philosophies are, even the mechanism, the machinery of the state is completely contradictory to the principles of economic development that, for example, IMF wants to impose? How can we talk about development if these international organizations do not take into account the values of the people concerned, so do not push for real effective participation of the people concerned, the people whose development we want to achieve? And how can we talk about leave no one behind if indigenous peoples are relocated, lose their livelihoods, and lose their natural resources in this understanding, a partial understanding, elliptical understanding of sustainable development? So to me, it was very obvious, glaringly obvious, that we cannot really talk about sustainable development if we do not include a cultural dimension. And I was very lucky in that this was also obvious to a lot of the civil society. So there is a growing movement, if you wish, among scholarship, but also especially civil society that deals with local authorities, and more generally civil society, that are asking for the addition of the cultural dimension in the post-2030 agenda. And they say that culture has to be an independent and autonomous goal, the promotion of culture, an autonomous goal. Because if you think the Sustainable Development Goals, they focus so much on economic development that it seems a bit hypocritical when we say that we don't believe that sustainable development is economic development anymore, and we believe that sustainable development should be more inclusive. If we really believe that sustainable development should indeed be more inclusive, the goals we have in order to achieve this sustainable development have to be also cultural. The targets we have, have to also focus on how to improve and how to promote and how to develop the values of the peoples concerned. And how do we do that if not by allowing people to revisit their own values, to discuss, to interact and exchange and discuss their own understandings? So I think that this is, in general, where my whole work on sustainable development comes from. So last year, a year ago, I submitted to the General Assembly of the United Nations my first report on sustainable development and cultural rights. Excuse me. Thank you. And in this report, I argued that development can only be sustainable or rather, I try to remind states that development can only be sustainable if it is determined by and if infused with the values of the people that it involves. It can only be sustainable if it addresses inequalities and crushes stereotypes. It can only be sustainable if it allows people to give their aspirations, to promote their aspirations and protect their resources and incorporate their heritage in all its dimensions, tangible, living, and natural. So a human rights approach with strong consideration on cultural rights must be the framework and must be the guarantee of success of any development agenda. The states listened carefully and very often agreed with me, but we are yet to see the actual action. So, for example, last September 2022, we had the Mundiakult celebration that UNESCO organized for cultural policies. And I'm sure that you're aware that I think 150 states, delegates, ministers of culture, most of them gathered in Mexico, where they proclaimed 150 states, where they proclaimed again the importance that culture has in sustainable development goals and also in sustainable development in general. And in two references of the outcome of this amazing celebration, in two places of the declaration, of the Mundiakult Declaration, states agreed that cultural rights are a tool to actually promote sustainable development. During Mundiakult, it became very obvious to me and everybody who was there present that states were very eager to say how they will improve cultural policies for sustainable development. They were very eager to say how important culture is in general and how their state prioritizes. But when it came to cultural diplomacy, but when it came to specific goals and to specific targets, I think the discussion was a little bit less ambitious. And the effect of the Mundiakult Declaration, without taking away any of its amazing contribution to the evolution of sustainable development and the infusion of culture and cultural rights in sustainable development discussions, but the effect has not become as known, as obvious, as visible as one would have hoped for. So many of you may know that in mid-September, states gathered in order to discuss how the SDGs are going, how sustainable development goals are going. And unfortunately, this discussion was, I think, 18th and 19th or 17th and 18th of September. And there was a declaration that came out of this. Of course, states said that we're not where we should be when it comes to sustainable development goals, and they renewed their commitment to push forward to achieve sustainable development goals. I was struck by the absence of culture and cultural rights in these discussions. I was struck with the justification that I was given that this meeting was really about resources when it came to sustainable development. And I was even more surprised because in the pre-meetings, a lot of people, not just me, a lot of people were talking about the cultural dimension of sustainable development. And I was also struck reading the voluntary reports, 40 voluntary reports that 40 states have created for the United Nations, where they talk about how they are achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. I was struck that in these 40 reports, so 40 states, when they talked about Sustainable Development Goals, they had nothing to say about culture. They had nothing to say about how they, push their population to revise their values, how their values are included in the economic development model that they promote, how social cohesion happens with public spaces where people can meet and interact. You know, cultural rights, it's such a huge umbrella of rights and initiatives and you know, aspects. I was struck that 40 states, the states that actually volunteered, so in a way, the states that care about sustainable development goals, had nothing to say about culture and cultural rights. So I cannot really see, you know, how we go from here and how sustainable development goals are indeed going to be materialized if the situation continues, if culture and cultural rights, defined as ways of life, defined as priorities and as visions and as philosophies and as practices, are repeatedly and continuously pushed aside. In the second somebody, actually, I have to say that somebody said at some stage, somebody told me, an ambassador said to me that, you know, we don't need culture and cultural rights as a standalone goal, because, you know, they decide in the discussion for sustainable development goals, for these sustainable development goals, it was seen that culture is transversal, so, you know, it feeds to all sustainable development goals. So we don't need to have culture as one, you know, standalone goal, but culture is mainstreamed everywhere. And they gave me the example, interestingly, of discrimination. They said that, you know, discrimination is everywhere. Yet, look at gender discrimination, you know, and gender equality. In Sustainable Development Goals, we talk about gender equality. It is a standalone goal. And at the same time, we also mainstream it through all the other goals. So, so I think that this argument is a bit thin. So this year, after last year, I decided that really there's a lot to talk about international organizations and the international governance and how they promote cultural rights in sustainable development. So we focused, I and my team focused on a lot of international organizations, and we asked for help from them, and we discussed, not in a way to be critical only, but in a way to be constructive. And I think the report was discussed a week ago in the before the General Assembly, the third committee of the United Nations General Assembly, and you can find it, of course, online. And in this report, I repeated that, unfortunately, cultural rights are completely absent from sustainable development policies when it comes to specific organizations. Things are not as bleak. UNESCO, for example, UNESCO are doing a lot of work when it comes to cultural rights and sustainable development. We see that a lot of, first of all, we see the Mondial Cult, but we also see a lot of specific projects that UNESCO has on promoting cultural rights and cultures in protecting cultures in sustainable development. And here I'm going to make a little pause to explain to you. My mandate, my role, is that of an independent expert at the United Nations. There are about 59 such mandates that are given by the Human Rights Council, 44, if I'm not mistaken, on thematic issues, and the rest on specific states. We have now one special rapporteur on Russia. We have, as you can imagine, on occupied territory of Palestine. We have on Syria, etc. And we also have on thematic issues, such as anti-terrorism measures to prevent terrorism, torture, right to life, right to education, etc. We are independent experts, which means that we can have our own opinions, even though we have been elected, appointed by the Human Rights Council for this position. And this position is for 3 years, renewed for another 3 years. My mandate started in 2009, and I am very lucky to have amazing predecessors. So my predecessor, the first Special Rapporteur, was Farida Shahid from Pakistan. The second Special Rapporteur was Karima Benoun from the USA and Algeria. And I am the third UN Special Rapporteur. I have already completed 2 years, and if states allow me, I have another 4 years. And if the sanity of this role allows me. I have to say that these roles are unpaid roles. So we just take our expenses, and so it coincides with our jobs. So I am professor of human rights at Brunel University. Sometimes I wonder whether my university remembers who I am, because it's quite busy. The difference between my mandate and UNESCO is this. My mandate is about the promotion and protection and the monitoring of cultural rights. So I am not here to protect cultures per se. UNESCO protects cultures per se. So all the amazing work that UNESCO has done and are doing on the protection of cultures has, of course, indirect effect, positive, very positive indirect effect on my mandate. However, my mandate is here to protect the rights to culture, not culture itself. So I'm interested in the cultural rights in sustainable development. And this usually doesn't make a big difference, but sometimes it does. So UNESCO would protect a building, but I'm interested mainly to see whether the people in the protection of this building, whether people have been relocated, whether they have lost some of their spiritual connection with this building, etc. So although UNESCO has done a lot of amazing positive work on sustainable development, I have the feeling that sometimes there has been, of course, a lack of communication between my mandate and them. We are all, unfortunately, working in silos. And although in the last 2 years, I have tried, and we have tried, UNESCO have tried very hard to work better together. And you can see that UNESCO now talks about cultural rights in sustainable development as well. And I talk about the protection of culture in sustainable development from time to time. At the same time, I think that we need to ensure that UNESCO respects the human rights culture and the cultural rights in all its protection of cultural heritage and cultural identity. This sometimes needs a little bit more attention. For example, UNESCO talks a lot about right to consultation, whereas really it is free, prior, and informed consent when it comes to indigenous peoples on matters that affect them directly. So on matters of sustainable development that affect them directly. In the same way, local populations. Sometimes local populations have free, prior, and informed consent in the way the protection of culture is going to go ahead and whether they're going to be affected. We have seen this, for example, in Tanzania, where UNESCO has tried to protect cultural heritage, but unfortunately, during the attempts to protect cultural heritage, cultural rights have been violated. In my report, I do say that sometimes UNESCO's system, which is very much focused on states, it is much more focused on states than the United Nations system, disappoints because states, UNESCO does not have a very clear monitoring processes and about the implementation of sustainable development initiatives. But UNESCO is definitely, in my report, is definitely the the star, the hero of Sustainable Development Goals and cultural rights. I also, in my report, I also looked at the United Nations itself, and I also said that unfortunately, even the United Nations, as I explained to you at the beginning, not all parts of the United Nations have understood and that the importance of the cultural dimension of sustainable development. In 2021, the Secretary General affirmed that a key driver behind his proposals to reform the UN development system was the need to tailor it better to the diverse needs, priorities, and circumstances. The Secretary General recognized that sometimes a one-size-fits-all approach to sustainable development failed to appreciate the diversity of specific countries in terms of income levels, vulnerability, history, culture, and more. So this is the report of the General Secretary A/75/905. The Secretary General, in another report that he did more recently, that they issued, acknowledges the importance of culture in sustainable development, but also the fact that it has been sidelined. But it's important to go beyond that. The High Commission on Human Rights has also accepted that culture and cultural rights have been sidelined, but it's important to go beyond that. And I told you how we make one step forward, two steps backward. Now we had the huge meeting on sustainable development goals where culture was again absent. In discussions in the United Nations, culture and cultural rights are absent. But still, you know, culture, things are improving, both at the United Nations level and at the UNESCO level. At the United Nations level now, I have a lot of discussions with treaty monitoring bodies, and it has become clear to me that even though the framework, you know, the cultural rights framework is not explicitly adopted in discussions relating to sustainable development, yet more and more treaty bodies, but also other UN officials do talk about what is essentially cultural rights. So that one size does not fit all, the importance of local visions, the importance of culture, of local priorities, etc. If we go to the World Intellectual Property Organization, the situation is a little bit different. I may remind you that the mandate of WIPO is to enable all countries to use intellectual property for economic, social, and cultural development. And although its work is very closely linked with cultural rights and sustainable development, as it focuses on protecting the rights of authors, creators, and inventors, and preserving cultural heritage, promoting cultural diversity, and respecting cultural rights. Unfortunately, the work of WIPO has not been framed on sustainable development, has not been framed in cultural rights, in a cultural rights framework, in a cultural rights system. However, we should not forget that there is progress in the WIPO approach to development, and the Committee on Development and Intellectual Property of WIPO has just updated a review of implementation strategies and modalities for development. And now there is an independent review of the technical activities. So this opens a lot of possibilities for more engagement with the cultural, you know, and more possibilities for cultural diplomacy, but also engagement with the cultural dimension of development. So this is something that I have become very aware. Maybe WIPO has not framed its work as cultural rights. However, it does do quite a lot of work that does promote cultural rights and sustainable development. We can also see a lot of progress when it comes to the World Bank. Serious concerns have been raised for a long time with respect to the World Bank and its human rights, the impact on human rights. And this was not really helped by the insistence on the World Bank not to recognize that human rights are within the human rights framework is a framework that they have to respect. And we were very surprised and delighted to see that, first of all, the World Bank adopted a new set of environmental and social policies called Environmental and Social Framework, which came into force in 2018. Now this framework has been very important, has been a pivotal moment for the World Bank. First of all, because hallelujah, for the first time, they said that the realization of human rights expressed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is something that the activities of the bank will support. So thank God, for the first time, we have the recognition that the bank has to follow at least the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So this is also an opening for us to go and ask for other human rights standards and whether they're implemented in the work of the World Bank. May I remind you that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is customary international law. So this means that it binds all states. And also, as you know, is the precursor of legally binding documents. So, this gives us a really good opening to discuss with the World Bank the coherence of their work with human rights standards, even if they don't want to refer to the term human rights, but we're still talking about the same thing. The environmental and social standards, the 10 standards, relate to cultural rights in several ways, and they go quite far in protecting them. Standard 7 is about indigenous peoples, sub-Saharan African, historically undeserved traditional local communities. And the bank recognizes a cultural dimension of development. So, this standard specifically says that the development process has to have full respect for the human rights, dignity, aspirations, identity, culture, and natural resource-based livelihoods of these peoples and these communities. So it is amazing that the World Bank, an organization that we have been criticizing fiercely, now has a standard that actually is in sync with human rights standards and cultural rights standards much more than other organizations that one would expect, that have always been much more positive towards human rights. The organization specifically talks about the free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples when the project has a significant impact on their cultural and spiritual heritage. Also, Standard 8, it's not just indigenous people. Standard 8 recognizes cultural heritage and its manifestations and how the cultural rights have to be respected, because it says, quote, it is an integral part of people's cultural identity and practice and an important asset for development. So this is, given the role of the World Bank in supporting development, this is fantastic, a fantastic improvement. However, one has to look at the practice, what happens on the ground. And on the ground, having talked to members of the World Bank, and people who work on the World Bank. We know that the World Bank now has given a lot more attention to employing not just economists, but anthropologists and sociologists and social people that are experts in social geography. And they actually do focus on the cultural rights and the traditions, etc., of the local populations. However, at the end of the day, they do this before they release the money to the state. There is no human rights impact assessment that the World Bank pushes. There is a social impact assessment that includes some human rights standards, and definitely in these impact assessments there are no cultural rights. So there is no monitoring. Although all these proclamations are really important, there is no monitoring on whether the cultural identity, the cultural dimension is indeed implemented in sustainable development. Even more so, we still have several complaints in the World Bank that discuss about very recent violations of cultural rights. The good part in the World Bank is that now, very recently, the bank has created a mechanism, an appeal mechanism, remedy mechanism, when the people concerned can go and ask for remedies when their cultural rights are violated in sustainable development processes. And this has happened. We have several cases. However, the cases the bank has recognized violations of cultural rights, which is amazing. However, the bank has said that unfortunately now the projects are almost completed and we cannot do anything but let us just focus on the education of these people, or let us try to kind of devise some mitigating measures, but not reverse the obstacles and the harm that has been made. So you see that the World Bank, in paper, it's very good. They are trying, I think, to push, or at least parts of the World Bank are trying to push for the cultural dimension on sustainable development, or at least not to violate cultural rights, but unfortunately, there's still quite a lot of work to be done. And when it comes to the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, I don't have a lot to say. The IMF refuses to engage. It is like a wall that we still have, and we still do not, we still cannot go any further, which is a real pity. So in concluding, I think that the sustainable development is still very much pushed aside, or rather cultural rights and the cultural dimension of sustainable development is still very much not recognized in discussions and debates and priorities in sustainable development. Cultural rights are still not explicitly addressed and linked to development. There are no cultural rights impact assessments that states or international organizations are pushing for. And sometimes in the best of cases, what we are experiencing is a piecemeal approach to cultural rights, rather than a conscious, focused, comprehensive human rights framing of sustainable development. A final issue is that sustainable development is still sustainable development discussions, when they bring in the cultural sector, they see it as an economic asset. So, artists, how much money, resources artists will bring, rather than as a resource for innovation and creativity and new ideas and revisibility of existing ideas. So in general, international organizations, unfortunately, still at the moment fail to respect cultural rights. And the only thing that we can do is push forward for the principles and the standards of participation and consultation. And I think that this is an opening that at least I feel that a difference I feel I can make by pushing the importance of effective participation that can take also the form of free, prior, and informed consent when circumstances warrant. I think the cultural dimension of sustainable development goal is going to be more visible, and also strengthening accountability mechanisms is another way that I feel that some progress will be made. Sustainable development is discussed a lot, continues to be discussed a lot at the United Nations and beyond the United Nations. And sometimes it feels like a wooden language that is talked, specific phrases that we keep repeating. And I think that what is important is that while we're waiting for states to take specific action, we remind them the inclusive and multi-layered approach that sustainable development should have. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much, Professor Xanthaki, for an awesome presentation, very detailed and exhaustive presentation. And I really like, the way you started your conversation with the phrase cultural rights continues to be the Cinderella of development. So I think generally culture has been taken for granted very much because when we talk about culture, we really, intangible heritage, tangible heritage, and then food and dress and this and that. And we didn't realize actually that culture was really the infrastructure. It was really the mental infrastructure that we need for sustainable development. And I like the way you really dissected the multilateral organizations here, how you've been working with the UN and understanding and interpreting how they are welcoming, accommodating, and cultural rights and the limits of the UN, UNESCO, WIPO, and then, of course, the World Bank. I think you did a tremendous job, except we're not in a hall where we could clap our hands for you, but we would have really clapped loud to say thank you for, you really demonstrated that you understand cultural rights. And it's actually, you helped me to understand that this is really the missing link. We can talk about accommodating, celebrating our differences, celebrating culture and so on. But if we do not respect cultural rights, we are really not making any headway. So I have, I know this is going to move us now to the question session. And I want to be, since I'm the chair, of course, I have the advantage of allowing myself to ask you the first questions. First, you talked about sub-Saharan Africa, especially with reference to the IMF, how they now acknowledge that indigenous rights, cultural rights needs to be respected in all projects. But in Africa generally, I'm just hearing, I live in Africa and I hear all these conversations. There's always a question, who gets to define human rights? I know you talked about the Declaration of Human Rights, which is binding, but who gets to define what we call human rights, and who defines what values are, and whose values take preeminence? And these are deep issues.
I think that this is a really. Oh, sorry, you have another question.
Yes, I have two others.
Oh,
and then I have two others. So you also know that the element of soft power. We talk a lot about soft power in ICRRA, the presentations about soft power, and the cultural diplomacy. But we also know that culture can be weaponized. So how do you negotiate between, soft power, diplomacy, and toxic weaponization of culture? And then finally, I was reviewing a video of your presentation, I think at Oxford University. You made some remarks about Israel and Gaza, which I thought was very profound. And you say that politicians are, and I know we might get in trouble now, but you said world leaders were talking about the conflict between Israel and Gaza purely in ethnic terms. And what you noticed there was that there was a complete ignoring of the issues of heritage, culture, and identity. I wanted you to elaborate on that a little bit because it really does help to put that conflict in perspective. Thank you very much. Maybe you could take those three first, and then I'll open it up now to the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. Really interesting and very difficult questions. So who gets to define human rights and the values? I think that, I think the states, but I think the states collectively have defined what they perceive human rights are and what the collective values are. I know very well the discussion about, Africa and Africanism and whether Africa kind of, Africa is represented in the human rights, in the human rights proclaimed by the United Nations. But I wonder whether these arguments and these discussions maybe do not give do not make justice to the amazing contribution Africa has made to the evolution of human rights standards. So when we talk about socioeconomic rights, Africa has been, and African states have been leading in defining socioeconomic rights, have been leading in making socioeconomic rights justiciable, rights to development, very important contribution of Africa. But I think that in this respect, I think that we are all bound by the human rights that the states have agreed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and then in the human rights treaties. Now, is it always so clear-cut? Of course it's not, and this is what makes your question so difficult, because the way you apply, human rights depends very much on the local realities and the local and the local circumstances. I think my view very generally is that, human rights have to apply it. We cannot say that, oh, my culture or my state, does not have the history of this right or does not have the history of that right. In my country, in Greece, unfortunately, recently, we have a lot of cases of femicide. So women being killed in most of the cases in domestic situations, and from time to time I hear how this is the Greek family works in very specific ways. Well, let's change how the Greek family works. I think that there are some rights that they don't allow for cultural particularities. Female genital mutilation, restricting women's rights. Iran, will say that, oh, don't interfere with our culture, but we are talking about gender apartheid. So really, human rights are the basic rights that all states have agreed. Which brings the second issue is what you're saying, how culture can be weaponized. And of course, and what is what should maybe the response of cultural diplomacy to this? So this is where I come from. I think that for a long time, culture has been seen as an obstacle, like religion. And culture and religion can't be obstacles, and they have been used, and they are used as facades to restrict human rights. However, in trying to restrict, in trying to minimize these situations, I think that we, the international community, have committed a mistake. We have reached a point where we do not take into account the transformational effect that culture has, the importance and the positive impact of culture. And if you talk, for example, to Indigenous women, as a white European woman, I was going and I was saying to them, are you feeling oppressed though? And they were saying to me, is it your culture? Are you feeling oppressed by your culture? Why don't we discuss this in international fora, how Indigenous women are oppressed? And what they were saying to me is that from time to time, yes, maybe there is an issue, let's discuss it, but let's also discuss how important our cultures have been in giving us strength, in giving us a core and a basis for our struggles for human rights. So I think that my decision when I became the UN Special Rapporteur, my objective is to again push the balance back to the way it should be. Yes, we recognize that culture is being weaponized, but no, I am not going to allow Iraq and Afghanistan and Iran to hijack the amazing concept of culture. This is, culture is a positive concept. Culture is transformational. It is amazing. It allows me to have my identity and to find strength in who I am. It allows me to dream and to link my past to the current and deciding on my future. And Iraq and Afghanistan are not going to hijack this and take this away from me. So I think that this is where I'm at when it comes to the weaponization of culture. Finally, when it comes to Palestine and Israel, but also to other, and this is also a very difficult question and a very long question, but also to other wars at the moment. If you look at the wars at the moment, you will see that in most of the cases, they have a cultural identity core. So Palestine and Israel for decades have been dehumanizing each other. And for decades, we had the language and actions of dehumanization. And even in 2-3 weeks ago, we have officials talking about human beings as animals. So this language means violation of cultural rights and disrespect of cultural identity. And I think that in this respect, and the same thing with Ukraine and Russia, the reason that Russia said it was the main reason for invading Ukraine was because they said there is no Ukrainian identity. So again, violation of cultural rights together with self-determination. So I think that this is the one aspect. The second aspect is that we have seen in Mali that the International Criminal Court has finally made explicit that arbitrary violation of destruction of cultural heritage, if done with the purpose to destroy cultural heritage, is a crime and will be seen as a crime. And I think that this has been, in 2016, this has been a really important step forward. And now we can use it to remind people in Palestine and Israel, but also people in Ukraine, etc., that the destruction of cultural heritage comes with consequences. And as an international community, we have to focus at these consequences and make sure that we apply the standards that as international community we have created.
Wow, thank you so much for your very elaborate response. I appreciate that. Odila, I now need help with the online questions. I think I can see one here. So it's dear Professor Xanthaki, I enjoyed your lecture a lot. Thank you again. You pointed out not just the bright sides of UNESCO work in the sphere of culture, but also the weaknesses and areas that still should be developed in the sphere of culture. Referring to that, you mentioned that according to your observation, UNESCO is more focused on state than other institutions, if I understood you correctly, which means that than other institutions, which means that at some point, the cultural dimension in sustainable development, cultural rights per se, and standards might be at some point a bit politicized, if I may call it like that. So weaponized, yes, which is what I said earlier. Yes, the directives of states are different sometimes, which impacts also on the possibility to set certain universal standards in that matter. May I kindly ask you to develop this part, please? And sorry for a bit of a long comment. So another good one for you.
So I think that UNESCO are, so shall I answer very quickly on this? Chair, would you like me to answer on this, or do you want me to take more? So, I think that...
okay, let me... There's another one from Odila. Maybe you could also take this one, and then you can, yes, you know, it says, Odila Tribal, dear Professor Xanthaki, thank you very much for this comprehensive presentation. What do you think are the major obstacles for the international governance environment you spoke about for not addressing culture as a way of life and focus on it more? And what are the reasons for IMF, as I understood you, to not engage in this discussion? Maybe you could take those two.
So IMF does not engage because they keep saying that they're not a human rights organization, and they close the door. That's it. So they are not open to discussions. We could not find anyone to talk from the IMF. We did not engage at all with IMF. You know, the wall is, the door is closed. You know, they keep saying that this is not within our remit. So it's very difficult to explain to IMF, you know, to even start the discussion with IMF, which is really a real pity because, of course, IMF, you know, in my country, in Greece, IMF imposed a specific model of economic development with the Greek, if you remember, the Greek economic crisis, where not just because of the IMF model, but in general, all these new measures led to a huge unrest, and the increase of suicides especially among male employees of 40 to 50, an amazing increase. So you cannot, you know, IMF cannot really say that, you know, they don't talk human rights, but this is what IMF does. The only way, what we can do is we can do diplomacy with states, because all these organizations are not organizations, like they're not these amorphous institutions that they want us to believe they are, where we cannot really discuss things with them. All these organizations are a collection of states. So if you take states one by one and you say to them, you do realize that, you know, you violate your own obligations under human rights, then, you know, maybe this is a way in the discussion. UNESCO has done a lot of work on this, but on cultural rights. But what I said is that, first of all, UNESCO does not allow for does not leave as much space for civil society as the United Nations. So civil society cannot go there and actually have the role that civil society has at the United Nations. And secondly, they don't always, because they're so focused on their work, they don't always have in mind the most current standards on cultural rights. So what I said to you, free, prior, and informed consent, you know, very often when you talk to UNESCO experts and UNESCO, in UNESCO meetings, you will see that the threshold they apply, the standard they apply, is right to consultation. Right to consultation does not go as far as free, prior, and informed consent. So the silos we work from means that we don't really, you know, they don't really completely endorse human rights standards, and this is a problem. And of course, you know, exactly because it has to do with states, this becomes a politicized issue. And especially when it comes to participation. So I talked to a couple of committees, UNESCO committees, and opening the participation was very difficult for them to recognize. And I think these were the discussions, right? And you asked me about how the international community can help and how diplomacy can help. I think I answered it was through. I think now I tend to believe that it should be through quiet diplomacy, to powerful states or to states that are friendly states. And I think that this is what is important. From Danish Cultural Institute, if I may, Jane talks about the cultural civil society actors, and I think that this is another very big discussion, very, very interesting question. So coming from indigenous rights, I was used to an extremely powerful and effective transnational indigenous movement that managed to put the indigenous rights to the center of the United Nations and to come up with a declaration that fulfills their claims. When I moved to culture, I can see that this is not the case in the civil society and the actors in the civil society. There's a lot of fragmentation. Exactly because culture is such a huge issue, we have a lot of civil society that focus on specific issues, but there isn't this coherent, consistent, coherent dialogue among the civil society and the actors on cultural rights that would give me at least the strength of going and speaking to states, knowing that I have the consent of all the civil society. This is something that, at least when it comes to NGOs, has been taken up by PEN America. So PEN America only last month decided to renew a initiative they started in 2019 to have cultural rights NGOs form a collectivity and maybe even form a collectivity at the United Nations level. For me, this would be, very and please, if you come from if you work with civil society, do get in touch with PEN America, Julie Trubeau, who actually is at the start of this. And I think this is very important. I think cultural rights can only become visible once the cultural civil society becomes powerful and united, and we haven't seen that. And
Gloria, you have
good luck. Sorry, Gloria, good luck with your MA. MA in evaluation, that seems like really interesting. And advice to students and regular people. We're all regular people, more regular than you you may think, to promote and protect cultural rights. I think the wide understanding of culture and what cultural rights means is really important. Being open to new ideas, to new developments, to new understandings, to new art, to new visions and interaction is exactly what cultural rights would hope individuals would do. So this is the way to help, I think.
And Professor, there was a question before Gloria's one from okay, it's gone a little up. This is from Marina.
Oh, Marina, this is very specific. You are putting really difficult questions to me. So my thoughts about the European Union initiative for a digital infrastructure that will connect cultural heritage institutions and professionals across the EU. I'm always really dubious about whatever the EU does these days. But I think the EU has not really grasped the wide understanding of culture yet. I think they focus a lot on cultural heritage, but maybe they push aside cultural identity. This morning, the reason why I was kind of a little bit, I came on time, but not earlier, was because I was finalizing an academic article on cultural rights of forced migrants. So the so-called migration crisis that has happened in the EU states have not changed. They have not recognized the violations of cultural rights and the dehumanization of these people, the focus on these people as threats to national security rather than as amazing resources of cultural frameworks and ideas and visions, etc. So having now the EU, the same EU, create a cultural heritage cloud, I think I haven't looked into it. I suspect, but maybe I should look into it and then talk. Digitalization is very important. Cultural heritage and cloud is very important, and especially digitalization of cultural heritage is very important. And we see some amazing initiatives. I would like more emphasis on cultural identity, not just heritage, and more emphasis on cultural heritage as living heritage. So I wonder, this is what I would like to see, whether this cloud includes living heritage and natural heritage as well.
It will. The questions are yet to come.
Yes, and hopefully it will be an effective measure. I haven't looked into it. The problem is that it will be an effective measure only if it defines culture in the most open way and only if it goes to the ground rather than to an EU elite that sometimes these initiatives go. But I'm looking forward to learning more about it. I'll look it up. Thank you.
Thank you. Members, we still have a couple of minutes for the discussion, so your questions are welcome. Please take advantage of our keynote speaker and ask your question. So maybe while we wait for the next question, Professor Xanthaki, you are a professor of law, and then you sound to me as a very strong cultural activist. I would even call you a cultural evangelist. So how do you negotiate these roles?
I am a cultural evangelist. I think that so last week when I was in Geneva, in New York, I spoke to some states and I was very surprised. One state said to me, Western state, informally, why don't you deal with the rights of LGBT persons? Because, you know, when we hear about cultural rights, we always think of oppression of women. Whereas if you deal with LGBT rights, then people are going to realize that you are progressive and cultural rights are progressive. And I had to explain to her that culture is really progressive. Culture is evolving. Culture is the amazing rap songs and the graffiti that we see and the youngsters coming up with words we don't understand. And you know, culture is really evolving. And also the concept of culture is one of the concepts that have been really evolving. We just have to ensure that when we talk about development, we really include what makes sense. And I think that what all of us have in mind, it includes, you know, our visions and our priorities, not the priorities of IMF and the priorities of the World Bank, but our priorities, our visions, our philosophies. And I think that this is the biggest challenge here. The role of children, that's really interesting. There's a lot of work There's a lot of work that is being done at the moment about the youth. So especially the youth, the cultural, the human rights defenders, the youth. I think that the children have been seen for a long time as recipients of culture. And I think that it is important more and more that we see children as partners in creating also culture. So this idea of participation, real participation in the creation of cultural frameworks is important when it comes to children. So not just to receive and to learn from a culture that sometimes parents, especially minority parents, left 20 years ago. I'm always surprised. I live in London, and I'm always surprised with some Greek second generation children who talk about Greek values in a way that where the values I recognized in Greece of the 60s, the 50s or the 60s. So first of all, children have to know the current, culture, but also they have to be partners in the evolution of this culture and the revision of this culture. The previous UN Special Rapporteur has done a fantastic report on mixing of cultures. This was a report, I think, in 2020. And I think that, children who come from mixed cultural backgrounds have this amazing ability to revise and renew and bring new, fresh ideas in cultures, and we have to listen to that. What do I mean about cultural diplomacy in the context of supranational institution? I think that cultural diplomacy is diplomacy that would promote culture, that will use culture, but would also promote culture. But I think that it's important that the culture that is being used is not only the culture that was defined in the 60s. So not only talking about culture frameworks of elites and cultural understandings of culture in the past, but I'm hoping that we're talking about dynamic interpretations of culture. I think it is very difficult, this cultural diplomacy, when it comes to international organizations. I think in the United Nations, maybe it is easier because non-states have a role to play, an established role to play. There is space for non-state actors. However, as I hope I explained, in other organizations, any non-state actor is very difficult to intrude. The UN consults with local communities a lot, but you have to remember that the UN does not shape sustainable policies. The UN pushes states to shape sustainability policies. The UN is very effective, I think, in discussing issues relating to sustainable development, but as I hope that I have shown, not taking into account the cultural dimension. This is something that we're working. The good thing is that the new High Commissioner on Human Rights, Volker Turk, is really committed to cultural rights. As he has told me, he wants his legacy to be the promotion of cultural rights. So we have a good ally there. And I think that he has a direct channel to Guterres as well. So I think that we should take this opportunity to really get in touch and run. I do know that there are a lot of initiatives at the moment in the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights regarding cultural rights that touch on cultural diplomacy. So I think that there is space there to push for the more visibility of cultural rights. And of course, the UN, you have to remember that the UN is the organization that came up with free, prior, and informed consent, and actually, pushed the free, prior, and informed consent in matters that in matters that are central to indigenous peoples, but also in matters that are central to local populations. And I think it was 2 weeks ago that we have the emergence, the creation of a new working group on peasants, which again, they have free, prior, and informed consent. So I think that the UN, there's a lot of work and a lot of emphasis in the UN on real effective participation. I just think that this real effective participation has not been framed also in terms of cultural rights. And I think that, and especially when it comes to cultural development, and I think that this is something that should change. And I'm hoping that all of you, defenders, supporters, and actors of cultural diplomacy will will help improving. Special envoy on the promotion of freedom of religion and belief outside the EU. So I'm not sure whether do you mean the Special Rapporteur on the UN Special Rapporteur? Because if you mean the UN, there is a UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief. Nazila Ghane is a very good friend. We know each other since we're doing our PhDs in the same university. But we are very clear that culture can be seen as being everything, like including religion, education. It can be seen as a huge umbrella. So I try to keep out from areas of culture where there are other mandates. So I keep out of education and I keep out of religion. But you were talking about the EU Special Envoy. I am here, the EU Special Envoy on the promotion of freedom of religion or belief outside the EU we can discuss. But my question is, why outside the EU? What about inside the EU? What about the promotion of freedom of religion and how religion is viewed and how different religions are talked about, such as Islam or other religions? How about what does the EU do about the standards within the EU? I think that the EU focuses a lot on the standards outside the EU, and I think that as the UN Special Rapporteur, I would like to focus on the standards within the EU. That's why my first official visit was in Germany last year, and the report on this is going to come out next March. And that was very important to me because I wanted to show that European states, Western states, European states sometimes talk a lot about what other states should do, understandably so. Globalization, and there is no human rights are not internal affairs. But at the same time, it's good to also put a mirror in front of us and try to see how we can improve our own human rights record. And I think that within the EU at the moment, there is so much, what I said, dehumanization of individuals because of their ethnicity and because of their religion. And we see this with Russians, with Israelis, with Palestinians, that we really have to work on that as well. But yeah, there is always space for discussion.
Thank you so much, Professor Xanthaki. Since there's no other question yet, I might ask you the last question, perhaps. I would like you to talk a little bit about decoloniality, which is something I picked up from your presentation at Oxford University. And we know that, you are a lawyer, and we can have very good laws and usually really great laws, but if people do not cooperate with the process of implementation, the law remains just in the books. So we know that mostly indigenous communities do not have the power and the strength really to push back against the hegemonic cultures. Do you really have faith in these legal frameworks and that they will actually work? That's probably the last question from me.
Thank you. I don't think that I can have faith or not in these legal frameworks. I think that legal frameworks are tools. I think my faith should be with states. And at the moment, there is so much polarization that my faith is declining every day even more. There was polarization last year in the General Assembly, and every time we were speaking, Russia would take the floor, and then Ukraine would take the floor, and then the USA would take the floor, and then Syria would take the floor, and then China would take the floor. And there was this endless ping pong where you had the feeling that we were not talking about what we were supposed to be talking. And I thought that, okay, maybe things are going to change. But this year, it's even more polarization. So Israel take the floor, and then, the states take the floor, and Germany takes the floor, and then, the Muslim states start taking the floor. So it's like the Islamic democracy. So it's even more polarization. And I think that this does not help the decolonization and the decolonization of the debates at all. Okay, I think that in cultural rights, in the 2 years that I've been, I think that there are two issues here. The first issue is that cultural rights promote the decolonization of all debates because it's about the local visions and the local understandings and the local priorities. So in this respect, cultural rights can be a positive force, a positive tool in completing, in promoting decolonization of narratives and debates, especially narratives, but also debates. Cultural rights are about cultural pluralism, are about the narratives that are being put through by the elites, ignoring the narratives of the other parts of the population. So this is the one aspect, that cultural rights can be an important tool. The second aspect is that we should decolonize cultural rights. So in the 2 years that I've been the Special Rapporteur, I see that the Nordic states, every time I talk about cultural rights, they respond with artistic freedom, and they respond with the right to speech. So this is not cultural rights. So they have a very specific Western European understanding of cultural rights. And my position, I feel, is to include, of course, artistic freedom, because it is very important. But first of all, to put artistic freedom in its rightful place as an outcome, a process of creativity, and not as free speech only. So there is a clear difference in pursuing artistic freedom as free speech, civil and political right, going back to speech, and pursuing it as a process of cultural rights, which is economic, social, and cultural rights, which is about creativity, and it is about it's not about civil and political rights. So I think that cultural rights. From the beginning, I said that I will also bring up, for example, Latin American views of what cultural rights are and how cultural rights work. And that's why my second visit is going to be to Panama. And then I have another visit to Chile, because I think that, the perceptions of these states to cultural rights are much more inclusive. And I think that also I'm committed to go to Africa, in order to show to people the amazing progress in cultural rights and understandings of cultural rights that currently is being made in Africa. So two aspects here. The first aspect is that cultural rights can be a tool. The second aspect is that cultural rights are also victims of another form of colonization, and more subtle, but still very, very prominent form of decolonization. So what I'm here to do is to ensure that international law and international human rights standards are also gradually decolonized.
Thank you very much, Professor Xanthaki, for a great presentation. And
may I also say, I'm sorry, Chair, may I also say, as a human rights lawyer, you cannot not have faith. You know that, in the majority of the times you're going to fail, but you're going to hold on the 2, 3, 5, 10 times that, things evolve. And you're going to keep repeating and keep dreaming about these times that have happened, so as to give you courage to continue to ask for change. But this change only comes when you have an active civil society, academic society, scholarship, activism working together. And I'm delighted to see that in this conference is so well attended. And we need you all to help with decolonizing these structures and decolonizing international human rights law at the end of the day.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation. And I want to thank you for honoring our invitation to be the opening keynote speaker. And I think, to borrow the words of Gloria, this has been a real eye-opener. And thank you for dissecting culture and taking us down to the anatomy of culture, and especially the important issue of cultural rights. So we thank you very much. And I would like to hand this back to Adila.
No, thank you very much. There's nothing more to add. Thank you very much for your moderation. And thank you very much again, Professor Xanthaki. And it was indeed a wonderful start for our conference. And we are well attended. The ICRRA member network is growing. And I think it was also very inspiring for the engagement in these kind of networks. So thank you very, very much. And for all the audience, there will be in the chat some more information to see you in the next session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the invitation and the fantastic discussion, and for the fantastic attendance. Good luck with the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. And thank you, Chair. You've been
a fantastic
Chair. Thank you.
It is a privilege.